early followers of Jesus believed in resurrection of the dead before they became believers. Resurrection was totally outside the cultural and historic expectations of first century Judaism. Some unbelievers, strapped for an explanation for the origin of the church, have suggested that the resurrection could be explained psychologically as hysterics or group hallucinations. Such theories give little or no evidence of an attempt to understand the historic context of Israel in the first century. There was no mental framework which would give birth to an idea of the resurrection. It's true that the Pharisees, with whom Jesus most closely identified, believed in a resurrection of the dead. However, this faith was part of their concept of the judgment, something that would happen at the end of the world when history was all over. It had no place within this world or this time. The Sadducees, on the other hand, did not believe in the immortality of the soul at all. And that, by the way, is the Judaism that has, for the most part, continued. There was no resurrection as far as they were concerned. This life was it. And you had to do your best in this life, because then it was over. And that's why they're sad, you see. You can remember the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees, because the Sadducees are sad, you see. It's slowly sinking in. Within pagan culture, the old philosophies had worked themselves into a dead end. The great philosophers Socrates, Plato, Aristotle had been dead for just less than 500 years, a span of time equal to that between Luther and the present. But their appeal had worn out. Some schools still held on. The Stoics were pantheists who believed that everything was spirit. The Epicureans were materialists. Each has its equivalent in today's world in New Age thought and scientific humanism. Mostly as today, the first century intellectual world was sinking into disillusionment. There was the normal group of kooks, just like today. The mystery cults were around to fill the vacuum created by the disappearance of any concept of truth, goodness, and beauty. And there were also the radical rebels against the establishment, which was Rome. And it was into that world that Jesus came and lived and died and rose again. And it was against this context that the church was born out of a confrontation with a risen Messiah. The resurrection hit the disciples as an inescapable fact. They witnessed to it in Jerusalem only days after the emotional events of the crucifixion. Such a witness would not have been possible if they themselves were not totally committed. They knew there was no chance their enemies could disprove it. The stone was rolled away. The grave was empty. They had seen and touched their resurrected Messiah with their own eyes. The courts of the first century had condemned Jesus to death, and God had reversed the decision. The first person to see the resurrected Jesus was a woman. Now, this may or may not be important depending on the observer. But if anyone thinks that men are spiritually more important than women in God's eyes, it's well worth noting. Here is a clear message that in our relationship to God, gender is not a significant factor. Mary Magdalene came from the city of Magdala, which has now been excavated and recently opened to the public. It's situated on the western point of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus would have visited here frequently and probably spoke in the synagogue, and Mary was an important part of Jesus' ministry. The addition to Mark's gospel tells us that Jesus had driven 7 demons from her. She was among the women who supported Jesus' ministry through her service and through her funds. Mary was loyal to Jesus beyond even the 12 disciples. She was there when they were not. She was at the cross. She was at the burial. And if there's a word that could describe Mary's relationship with Jesus, it might be intimacy. She stayed very near to him, ministered to his needs right to the end. There was nothing improper in her affection. Jesus was her rabbi. That's an important word for us to understand in the context of first century Judaism. The root is Rav. It means great or large or senior. It's most often used to mean teacher. The suffix is simply I, which means my. So rabbi means my teacher. In the first century, it was not a professional category as it is today. It's a term of affection and respect and loyalty. John's Gospel tells us that when Mary finally recognized Jesus in the garden of the tomb where he had been buried, she called him Rabbi. And he then began to teach her concerning his post-resurrection presence with his church. To Mary, this was a particularly important lesson because she wanted to hold on to his physical presence. Jesus told her his physical presence was temporary, and she had to let go of that in order to experience his spiritual presence in the future. I understand Mary. I like to see my realities, to hold on to them, to examine them with all my senses, to go and hug my dad. I know he's there in Florida, but I need to occasionally go and hug him. I need that physical reality. I know that the Holy Spirit is real, though. And as a Christian, I have the glorious hope of the Messiah's return. And then we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is, face to face. Mary faithfully tells the disciples who are still mourning and weeping and in hiding that she has seen Jesus and their rabbi is alive. But they can't believe that because they haven't seen him. Mark tells us that next Jesus appeared to 2 disciples while they were walking in the country. We find the long version of this story in Luke 24. These 2 also had difficulty recognizing Jesus. After all, they had no concept of a resurrection. They tell the risen Lord all about himself, how he was a prophet and a great teacher, and how the religious authorities handed him over to be crucified, and how some of the women said that the tomb was empty and Jesus was alive. But they didn't recognize him, so they don't believe yet. I can only imagine Jesus trying hard not to laugh as they relay this story. He instead becomes the rabbi again, and he teaches them how all of this had to be in fulfillment of the scriptures and the prophecies. It's only when they sit down to eat and Jesus breaks the bread that the eyes of these disciples are opened and they break forth into faith. Their hindsight is excellent. Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? These 2 disciples immediately run back to Jerusalem to tell the others the good news. But they still don't believe because they haven't seen. The final appearance that Mark tells us about is to all of the 11 while they were eating. Remember, Judas is gone by now. This appearance is most likely the one which John and Luke place in the upper room. The disciples are still hiding, in spite of being told more than once that Jesus is alive. They are living in fear of the religious leaders and struggling with what the future will be like without Jesus, because they don't believe the news that they have heard. There's a lot of fear in our world. Many people in Asia are walking around wearing surgical masks because they're afraid of infection. Many are stockpiling non-perishable supplies because they fear war and natural disasters. I have a book that I think is funny. Michael gave it to me several years ago. It's called The Pop-Up Book of Phobias. It's filled with pop-up art of all the things people are afraid of. Spiders and snakes and dentists and airplanes and clowns. It just goes to show there's a lot of fear in this world. One of the fundamental lessons of the gospel is that we need not fear any longer. The risen Christ comes to us unexpected and surprising, walking right through our locked doors and beyond our fears to offer us something new. He's awesome and awe-inspiring and fearful in his power, but he's also comforting and loving and reassuring in his life-giving promises. As the disciples are gathered in the upper room, doors locked while they discuss their fears of the future, the risen Christ comes to them. Mark tells us Jesus, like any good teacher, rebuked them for their lack of faith and their refusal to believe what they had been told by Mary and the 2 disciples from the road. John tells us Jesus also gave them peace. Peace be with you. Jesus tells them to open their closed minds and get out from their locked doors. There's work to be done. Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. And now they have seen him and they believe. And they go out and begin preaching. The doors are all open, and bolts can no longer keep the risen Christ from our lives. He comes to us in all kinds of unexpected places. In graveyards as we face the reality of death. Along the road as we ponder the journey of life. And behind closed and locked doors where we live in our fear and our doubt. Jesus comes and says, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in. Why not open the door? He brings peace and hope and an eternal adventure when we follow him. He gives us a new job to do in our future with him. Go and tell the world so that they too can be released from their fears and their doubts. And finally, he gives us a promise. Matthew tells us of these final words Jesus spoke to his disciples. Surely, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I've been reading devotionals by C.S. Lewis. They're excerpts from his books. And the one for this morning was the story of, I believe it's Lucy, who gets the sorcerer's spell book. And she speaks the spell that makes invisible things visible. And all the hidden things in the sorcerer's castle begin to appear. And suddenly Aslan, the great lion, appears. And she says, Aslan, you've come. And Aslan, of course, says, I've been here all along. You just made me appear. And she says, well, how could I make you appear? And he said, don't you think that I obey my own rules? I've been here all along. You have to invite me to appear. Surely I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Come out from your locked doors and live in faith. Amen.
Amen.
Our closing hymn is going to be in the praise book number 54. And as we stand and sing, if you've never unlocked the door of your heart and your life to Jesus, I would love to talk with you and pray with you after worship today and celebrate that new life with you today. Number 54 in the praise book. Let's stand together and sing.
Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Summer and winter and springtime and harvest, sun, moon, and stars in their courses of love, join with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, mercy, and love. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Pardon of sin and of peace that endureth, thine omnipresence to cheer and to guide. Strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Blessings all mine with 10,000 beside. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, great unto me.
And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and through you, and grant you his grace and his peace this day and forevermore. Amen. Amen. Lift high the cross, the
cross of Christ proclaim, till all the world adore his sacred name.
Amen. What kind of procedure did Loretta have?
She had really inflamed because of the bones.
Uh-huh.
So they beat the bones.
Okay, and reattached the Achilles.
I don't think it was the same thing.
No, but they had to remove the Achilles to get the spur
Well,
off.
they whatever they had to do. They used a lot of things to keep the bones. Now she's taking down.
It sounds invasive, but if they do the minimum amount, I was trying to tell Linda her dad, they do the minimum amount of invasive, which usually is like, that usually heals. But if you abuse it, then they have to go in and use stronger. And with time, he did stronger, and the doctor said, he said, you can't just raise too much, you can't use chronic. He said, you don't do it. following you by this, you know.
Leave a lot.
Bone round.
It's great.
Yeah.
But the real walker.
Yeah, those are great. I love those. Those are so funny.
It's probably getting from the real walker to someplace else.
Yeah, you have to use the other
So
foot.
you got one foot from the walker. Sometimes it's tough.
You have to learn how to use the weight. Yeah, exactly. Well, she should be fine if she follows the doctor.
Well, we're gonna go see the doctor tomorrow.
Good. I'm going to take a little break back and see if there's still some here. Yes, praise God.
Yeah. He's got a new job. And that if he does like a Saturday service, he might call me in there to do a solo. He said that song.
Oh, I do have two heads. Aren't you lucky?
Thank you.
Those in hyacinths and crocuses are the only thing that I can decently grow in the garden. Because you don't have to do anything with them. You put them in here and they just keep coming. I have those little ones that we had from you. So, tell the lady.
All right. This is